After Japan, Germany also wants to deal a hard blow to America. It is the quiet betrayal that nobody in the mainstream financial press wants to admit is happening. Because once you understand the mechanics of this move, you realize the global faith in the US dollar isn't just shaking, it's actively collapsing. And in this video, we are going to expose the specific logistical nightmare that proves the Federal Reserve might simply be running out of the one asset that matters. For the last few weeks, all eyes have been on Tokyo. We watched as Japan began dumping US treasuries to save the yen, effectively selling American debt back to America. But while everyone was distracted by the bond market, a much more dangerous signal began flashing in Frankfurt, Germany. The economic engine of Europe isn't just worried about currency fluctuations. They are worried about solvency. They don't just want to sell paper. They want to physically remove the collateral. We are talking about the Deutsche Bundesbank, the German central bank. They hold the second largest gold reserve on the planet, a staggering 3,378 tons. At today's prices, that hoard is worth roughly $280 billion. But here's the problem, and it's a problem that keeps central bankers awake at night. For decades, Germany didn't actually hold most of that gold. They trusted us. They trusted the United States to hold it for them in the bedrock vaults of New York. But that trust is evaporating when a neighbor starts installing heavy security doors and buying ammunition. You don't ask why, you just lock your own windows. Germany sees Japan dumping dollars. They see the US national debt spiraling past sustainable levels. And they have made a calculation. They know that in a crisis, possession is 10/10 of the law. This isn't just standard banking procedure. This is a run on the bank executed at the sovereign level. The difference is, when you go to the ATM, you want a few $100. When Germany goes to the window, they want 270,000 bars of heavy yellow metal, and they want it now. To understand why this recall is such a logistical and geopolitical earthquake, we have to look at how a massive chunk of Europe's wealth ended up sitting in a vault 80 feet below Manhattan in the first place. It wasn't an economic decision. It was a survival strategy born from the terrified logic of the Cold War. After World War II, West Germany was an economic miracle, accumulating massive trade surpluses. Under the Bretton Woods system, those surpluses turned into gold. By the height of the Cold War, the Bundesbank had amassed a hoard of 3,378 tons. But geographically, West Germany was a nightmare. They were the front line. Strategic planners in Bonn and Washington knew that if the Soviet Union ever decided to roll its tanks through the Fulda Gap, Frankfurt would be overrun in days, perhaps hours. The gold had to be somewhere else. It had to be west of the Rhine, far beyond the reach of the Iron Curtain. So a massive distribution operation began. The logic was simple. Store the gold with the Allies who would help liberate Germany if the worst happened. They sent 13% to London and 11% to Paris. But the lions share the ultimate. Insurance policy was sent across the Atlantic, approximately 1,536 tons. Nearly half of Germany's total national wealth was deposited at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. For decades, this arrangement made perfect sense. It was safe, it was liquid, and it was protected by the US military. But then the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The tanks never came by the early 2000s. The existential threat that justified storing over $130 billion worth of gold on a different continent had vanished. Yet the gold stayed. It sat there year after year, gathering dust in the dark, and for a long time, nobody in Berlin asked any questions. It was just a line item on a spreadsheet. 1,536 tons. Location, New York. It was assumed to be safe. It was assumed to be there, but in the world of high finance, assumption is the mother of all failures. The Germans were about to learn that leaving your family jewels in someone else's safe for 50 years creates a very dangerous kind of temptation for the custodian. The slumber didn't last forever. In late 2012, the comfortable silence between Frankfurt and New York was shattered not by a foreign army, but by a domestic audit. The Bundesbank, the German Federal Court of Auditors, woke up and decided to ask the Bundesbank a very simple yet devastatingly awkward question. When was the last time you actually checked the inventory? The answer was shocking. The Bundesbank admitted that they had never physically verified the gold stored in New York, not once. For decades, they had relied entirely on yearly written confirmations from the Federal Reserve. They were holding $130 billion of the German people's wealth based on a polite, "Trust me, bro," from a foreign central bank. The auditors were furious in a report that leaked to the press. They slammed the central bank for failing to apply even the most basic inventory controls that a grocery store would use for cans of soup, let alone a sovereign nation guarding its bullion. This bureaucratic failure ignited a firestorm. Enter Peter Boehringer, a German economist and activist who launched a public campaign titled Holt unser Goldheim. He wasn't just asking for paperwork. He was channeling a growing national anxiety. He argued that if the gold wasn't in Germany, it wasn't really Germany's gold. The movement gained traction rapidly because it tapped into a primal mactosocial truth. If you can't touch it, you don't own it. The pressure became politically undeniable. In January 2013, the Bundesbank capitulated. They announced a massive change in policy. They weren't just going to audit the gold they were going to ship. The plan was to repatriate 300 tons from the New York Fed and another 374 tons from Paris. It was supposed to be a standard logistical operation, a heavy-moving job. But the moment Germany asked for their property back, the situation got weird. But if the teller starts sweating, making excuses, and tells you to come back in a week, you know you have a serious problem. Germany was about to get the runaround of the century. The response from the Federal Reserve was polite, bureaucratic, and utterly baffling. When Germany asked for their 300 tons, the Fed didn't say no. They said, yes, of course, but it will take time. Specifically, they laid out a timeline that stretched all the way to the year 2020. They were asking for a relatively small portion of the total stockpile. Let's pause and do the math, because the numbers simply do not add up to a standard logistical operation. We are talking about 300 tons. In the world of industrial shipping, it is a rounding error. A modern Boeing 747 freighter has a maximum payload capacity of roughly 110 to 120 tons. Theoretically, you could load the entire German request onto just 3 airplanes. You could fly them out of JFK on a Monday, a Wednesday, and a Friday and have the entire operation finished before the weekend, even if you wanted to be hyper-conservative with security and insurance limits. Spreading it out over a few months would be generous, but 7 years. That averages out to approximately 43 tons per year. That is a trickle. It implies a delivery schedule so slow that it defies all logic, unless the delay wasn't about transport, but about procurement. The sheer absurdity of this timeline sent shockwaves through the gold community. It raised a terrifying possibility. The gold wasn't sitting on pallets, ready to go. If you go to a valet parking stand and ask for your car, and the attendant tells you it will take 7 hours to retrieve it, you know he isn't just walking slowly. You know he doesn't have your car. He has to go find it. The suspicion that immediately took root was that the Federal Reserve needed to buy time. If the specific bars allocated to Germany had been leased out, swapped, or encumbered in complex financial contracts, they couldn't simply ship them. They would have to unwind those positions, buy gold back from the open market, or wait for leases to expire. The 7-year stall wasn't a shipping schedule, it was a recovery timeline. They needed that window to scramble and refill the vault. Without causing a panic in the global gold price, they were buying time, hoping Germany and the world wouldn't ask why the shelf was empty when the first shipments finally touched down on German soil. The relief in Frankfurt should have been palpable, but for those paying close attention to the details, the arrival of the gold didn't solve the mystery, it deepened it. The cargo crates were opened. The seals were broken. The bars were inspected, and what the Bundesbank received was startling. A significant portion of the shipment consisted of brand new, gleaming bars fresh from the mold. This might sound like a bonus. Who doesn't want shiny new gold? But in the world of forensic accounting, this was a disaster. The Federal Reserve offered a convenient technical explanation. They claimed that the original German bars deposited back in the 1950s and 1960s were outdated. They supposedly didn't meet the current London good delivery standard, the strict set of rules governing the weight, purity, and shape of bars traded in global markets. The Fed argued that the old bars were brittle or oddly shaped, so they had helpfully melted them down and recast them into modern 400-ounce bars before putting them on the plane. On the surface, that sounds like a polite customer service upgrade, but scratch that surface, and you find a gaping hole in the chain of custody. When you deposit allocated gold, you are depositing specific items with specific serial numbers. It's like checking a coat at a cloakroom. To pay Germany back, they would have had to purchase random gold from the open market, melt it all down to erase the disparate serial numbers and refinery stamps, and then cast it into uniform bars with fresh Bundesbank insignia. The recasting story provided the perfect cover for this replacement operation. It explains the delay. Melting takes time. And it explains why the serial numbers on the manifest didn't match the metal in the vault. Germany got their value back, but they almost certainly did not get their gold back. And that distinction proves that for years, the vault in New York may have been holding nothing but air and IOUs. This specific incident with the melted bars is not an isolated glitch. It is the visible crack in a much larger systemic lie that underpins the entire global financial system. What the Bundesbank stumbled into is a mechanism known to insiders as rehypothecation, though a more honest description might be fractional reserve banking applied to tangible assets. It is the dirty little secret of the gold market. The amount of paper claiming to be gold vastly exceeds the actual physical metal that exists in vaults. To understand how this scheme operates, you have to look at the London Bullion Market Association, LBMA, and the COMEX in New York. These are the casinos where the price of gold is discovered. But they aren't trading metal. They are trading promises. Analysts estimate that for every single ounce of physical gold sitting in a registered vault, there are anywhere between 100 and 500 ounces of paper gold, futures, contracts, derivatives, and unallocated certificates floating around in the financial ether. It is a massive game of musical chairs played with billions of dollars, where the music never stops until it does. Think of it like a greedy parking garage owner in a busy city. This garage has exactly one parking spot, but the owner, knowing that people rarely park for the whole day, sells 100 monthly parking passes for that single spot. He collects cash from 100 customers, betting on the statistical probability that they won't all show up at the same time. As long as only one guy drives in, the system works. The owner looks like a genius, but the moment a second guy shows up, or worse, a tour bus like a sovereign nation pulls in and demands that spot, the illusion shatters. The owner has to scramble, bribe people, or buy a spot from a neighbor at a premium to fulfill the contract. Germany was that tour bus. When they demanded delivery, they stress-tested the ratio. They forced the system to convert paper promises into heavy, cold reality. The reason the Federal Reserve and the bullion banks are terrified of nations. Repatriating gold is simple. It removes the base of the pyramid. Every physical bar that leaves the vault destroys the backing for hundreds of paper contracts. It reduces the inventory available for the shell game. The 7-year delay wasn't incompetence. It was the system creaking under the weight of its own leverage, desperately trying to find a physical chair when the music stopped. This brings us to the most dangerous legal trap in the entire precious metals market, a trap that snares sovereign nations and retail investors alike. It is hidden in the dense fine print of custodial agreements and centers on the distinction between two boring-sounding terms, allocated and unallocated. Most people, when they buy gold, assume they have purchased a physical asset. They imagine a specific bar sitting on a shelf with their name tagged on it. But unless you have specifically paid for allocated storage, that is almost certainly not what you own. In the vast majority of cases, central banks and large institutional investors hold what are called unallocated accounts. This is the default setting for the banking world because it is cheaper and more efficient. In an unallocated account, you do not own any specific bars. You do not have legal title to a physical object. Instead, you have a claim against the bank. You are effectively an unsecured creditor. The bank owes you a certain amount of fine gold. But until you demand delivery, that gold is just a number on a ledger. The legal difference here is catastrophic in a crisis. If you own allocated gold and the bank goes bankrupt, the liquidators cannot touch your bars. They belong to you, not the bank. The bank is merely the landlord of the vault. But if you hold an unallocated account and the bank collapses, your gold is considered part of the bank's general assets. It gets thrown into the pot to pay off all the bank's other debts. You don't get your medal. You get to stand in line with bondholders and janitorial staff, hoping to recover 5 cents on the dollar in paper currency years down the road. This is the unallocated trap. It is why storage for unallocated gold is often free, because the bank is using your capital to trade, lease, and gamble. They are using your asset as their collateral. The Bundesbank realized that holding their reserves in New York, regardless of the technical classification, carried the same existential risk as an unallocated account. If the US dollar system were to suffer a systemic seizure, or if the Federal Reserve had to prioritize American stability over foreign obligations, Germany's claim would be just a piece of paper, by demanding the physical metal. Germany was doing the only thing that matters in a bear market. They were converting counterparty credit risk into a tangible sovereign asset. They were moving from you owe me to I have it. Fast forward to right now, late 2025. The dust from the 2013 audit has settled. But a new, far more volatile storm has arrived from the east. This is where the story pivots from a historical curiosity to an immediate global emergency. The trigger, as discussed earlier, is Japan. When the Japanese Ministry of Finance began offloading billions in U.S. treasuries to prop up the collapsing yen, they didn't just move a market, they rang a bell that cannot be unrung. Japan was effectively shouting to the world that the U.S. Treasury bond, the bedrock of the global financial system, is no longer a risk-free asset. For a country like Germany, this is a terrifying realization. Germany's economy is export-driven, conservative, and deeply allergic to inflation. Asterisk, they hold vast amounts of foreign currency reserves, much of it in U.S. dollars and U.S. debt. But if Japan continues to sell, the value of those dollars is going to plummet. The Federal Reserve will be forced to print trillions to buy up the debt that Japan is dumping, initiating a doom loop of currency debasement that will erode the purchasing power of every dollar held abroad. Berlin is watching this in real time. They see the writing on the wall. They realize that holding paper dollars or U.S. government bonds is now a liability. It creates a dependency on American fiscal policy, which is currently spiraling out of control. If the dollar tanks, a huge chunk of Germany's national wealth evaporates overnight. They need a hedge. They need an asset that acts as a shield against American inflation and American default. They need an asset that has zero counterparty risk. That asset is physical gold, and this is why the 2013 repatriation was just the prologue. Remember, even after that operation, Germany left approximately 1,236 tons of gold in the vaults of the New York Fed. They left it there because they thought the crisis had passed. But the Japan signal changes the calculus entirely. The 300-ton move in 2013 was a stress test. It was a probe to see if the system worked. The result, the 7-year delay and the melted bars, was a warning. Now, faced with a potential dollar collapse triggered by Japan, Germany isn't just asking for a small portion back. Rumors are swirling that the Bundesbank is preparing for a total exit. They don't want to be the last creditor standing in line when the dollar loses its reserve status. They want to trade their paper, IOUs, for the hard stuff before the exit doors are welded shut. If Germany actually pulls the trigger on the rest of that gold, if they demand their remaining 1,236 tons sitting in New York, we are looking at the end of the gold market as we know it. This is where the math of the paper gold scheme comes home to roost. Currently, the price of gold is hovering around $4,345 an ounce to the average person. That sounds expensive, but don't be fooled. That price is a fiction. It is a number derived from the trading of paper contracts on the COMEX, where supply can be magically created by typing zeros into a computer, even at $4,345. The price is being artificially managed because the supply of paper contracts is theoretically infinite. But what happens when the physical metal is removed from the ecosystem? If Germany repatriates its bullion, that gold leaves the banking system entirely. It goes into a sovereign vault in Frankfurt, where it can no longer be leased, swapped, or used as collateral for paper contracts in New York or London. It is effectively off the board. When you remove the physical collateral that backs the 100-to-1 leverage of the paper market, the leverage creates a violent snapback. It is the financial equivalent of a short squeeze, but on a planetary scale. Suddenly, the bullion banks that sold those paper promises have a problem. They are short millions of ounces of gold they do not have and cannot get. The moment the market realizes the vault is effectively empty, the link between paper gold and physical gold snaps. This is called decoupling. The screen might still say $4,345. But try to buy a physical coin or bar from a dealer. They will laugh at you. They won't sell it for $4,345. They might not sell it for $8,000 in a decoupling event. The true price of gold is discovered, and without the artificial suppression of the paper market. Analysts project that price isn't $5,000 or $6,000. It is likely closer to $20,000 an ounce or higher.